Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're going to wait till a few more people have gotten signed in, and then we will begin. Welcome, everyone, to AWI's monthly lunchtime talk. I'm going to give it just another minute while people get signed on, and then we will begin the presentation. All right, well, we're about halfway to the total we're expecting today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and our speaker. And hopefully before Mead begins, we'll have everyone signed in. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Kim Lutz. I'm the Executive Director of America's Watershed Initiative, or AWI. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a basin-wide, the entire Mississippi River Basin, basin-wide nonprofit that focuses on dissemination of science and data to inform decision-making. And this talk is an outgrowth of that part of our work. We also work on developing collaboratives such as the Mississippi River Watershed Partnership. So we are delighted to have with us today Mead Allison. Mead is a professor in the Department of River Coastal Science and Engineering at Tulane University. His research focuses on sediment dynamics in coastal and riverine environments, including lowland rivers, deltas, wetlands, estuaries, and continental shelf systems. His work examines both contemporary sediment processes and the late Holocene sediment record preserved in coastal landscapes, with particular emphasis on sediment transport and deposition in the Mississippi River Delta and Gulf coastal region, and their implications for coastal restoration and long-term landscape evolution. Before I turn it over to Mead, I'll just remind you that if you want to ask a question of Dr. Allison at the end of the talk, you can either put it in the chat feature, or if you, I'm not sure how it's displaying on your screen. On mine, there is a button that says more with 3 dots, and there's actually a Q&A tab there. So if something he remarks upon piques your interest, please go ahead and put it in the chat. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mead.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to AWI for having me today. Let me get my slides up here. Can you see them okay? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the title is Implications of Water Loss from the Lowermost Mississippi River. And by lowermost, I mean the very lowest part of the system below the city of New Orleans, where I'm employed at Tulane University. And so you'll see in this slide that this section of the river is extremely important in terms of navigation, the navigation industry. The 5 ports that together make up the port of South Louisiana and the lowermost part of the river are the nation's largest in terms of total tonnage. And as it says in the upper right, it's mainly because it's moving an extraordinary amount of cheap bulk cargo, soybeans, wheat, coal, things of that nature. And New Orleans is the main player and handles the majority of the container cargo as well. And so the figure in the lower right is just sort of showing once that material, when it's imported, gets onto container or off of the vessels onto trucks, it moves out across the country. So it's material moving from the Mississippi Basin down into this port system and then being exported, but it's also imported materials that come in by the navigation channel and then head back by truck into the interior United States. Um, the lowermost part of the system, from Baton Rouge down, which is roughly the lower 168 miles of the river, well, actually the lower 250 some miles of the river, is a deep draft navigation channel, and it's maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to a depth that recently, in the last few years, was deepened to a 50-foot channel. And that means that ocean-going vessels can move up the river as far as Baton Rouge. Beyond that point in the system, as many of you know, we're in a shallow draft navigation channel, and so you're sort of limited to barge traffic. So the port system down here handles all the ocean-going cargo. Um, the dredging that goes on to keep this 50-foot navigation channel going. In the upper part of the system between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is deep draft crossings. It's a little bit of dredging that goes on where the channel goes back and forth between the east and the west bank. They often have to dredge to keep that shallow sill between the two at 50 feet, and they just cast that material downstream. It's not removed from the river. The more important dredging is here in the mouth of the river in what's called the Southwest Pass, from Southwest Pass up into the river to about the town of Venice, is the nation's largest, or let's say most expensive dredging operation caused by the Corps of, or carried out by the Corps of Engineers, because of course you have this massive amount of sediment coming down the Mississippi system. And as you approach the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of that material comes to rest and then needs to be dredged. And that material is removed from the river and is presently being used for things like beneficial use placement down in the lower delta. This is a figure showing from a paper of ours, kind of showing the volume of material that is dredged from this Southwest Pass reach of the channel adjacent to the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see that the dotted line sort of shows the total annual discharge of the Mississippi River. And you'll notice the dredging kind of fits fairly well with the size of the flood annually. So in other words, larger floods deliver more sediment to the lowermost part of the system, and that has to be dredged. And it's a massive amount of material. This figure is in cubic meters, millions of cubic meters per year. And you can see the largest number is like 36 in 2019 was about 36 million cubic meters, and 10 million cubic meters is about 13 million cubic yards for those of you that think in English. So we're talking on the order of 50 million cubic yards have to be removed from this dredge channel during a large flood year. So what I really want to talk about is the results of what we put in this relatively short paper, and you're welcome to go seek this paper out. And the goal of the paper was to kind of talk about, my co-authors and I, to talk about the fact that in this reach below New Orleans, there are a series of exits that remove water before you get to the deep water passes to the Gulf of Mexico. And this is a snapshot during a period of very high discharge when the Bonnie Carey spillway was open, and then how much water is lost from some of these exits before you reach the so-called head of passes here, which are the fingers in the birdsfoot, and the navigation channel goes down Southwest Pass to the Gulf of Mexico. And so what you can see based on measurements that have been made in these passes and exits, between about 2004 and even 2022, we went from about 45% to about 55% of the water was lost from this reach south of New Orleans through these different exits. Now, one of the things we find is that many of these exits are unintentional, let's say, in the sense that this is the exits around the reach of Fort St. Philip. This is the town of Venice right here, about 11 miles up the river from the so-called head of passes split. This is a reach called Fort St. Philip. And you'll notice there are a series of exits leaving the river here. And these were opened in the large flood of 1973. And as it says here at the top, loss of nav channel containment. One of the peculiarities of the system is the Mississippi River and tributaries levees, the earthen levees that are utilized for flood control, extend all the way to Venice on the right descending bank, but only come down here to about Bohemia, 45 miles up the river from Head of Passes on the left descending bank. And what's happening here is with the absence of a levee and rising sea level and subsidence, we're starting to see failures occur during large floods along this section of the bank. Between River Mile 44 and Head of Passes, there are a series I'm going to show you of these failures caused in different ways. And we've recently been making measurements, and so you can get an idea of how much water is escaping. Fort St. Philip, it's about 128,000 cubic feet per second during a large flood in last April when we were measuring about 1.1 million CFS in the river coming into this reach. So about 11% of the river coming into this reach was going out of these exits. Mardi Gras Pass is another one that opened in the 2011 flood. That's carrying another measured 21,000 CFS. And you can see water moving through into some of these artificial back channels and then coming out into the Gulf of Mexico laterally. The largest one of these things is the so-called Neptune Pass, and this is sort of showing in 1998 versus last year the size of some of these failure points. And Neptune Pass really began forming in the large floods although it was present as a small channel of artificial origin in the 80s. In the big floods in 2016 through 2020, it expanded enormously and now is carrying on the order of about 14% of the river. That's 156,000 cubic feet per second, which makes it about the third largest river in the United States in terms of discharge. So we would argue that these failures and expansion of channels are because of the fact that there's only a natural levee along this section of the river that's much degraded by rising sea level. And the absence of an artificial river levee means that we're beginning to see a series of failures along this bank line that run the risk of not completely losing the channel, but reducing the stream power sufficiently that it is going to have implications for the deep draft navigation channel, as I'll show you here. So these are a couple of figures from this paper, and what you'll see is on the left, we used a model, a 1D numerical model to try and anticipate how much this loss in stream power through this reach changed or how much the loss of water through all of these exits changed the stream power in this reach. And it's on the order of about a 30% reduction in the river channel stream power. And when you reduce the stream power, you reduce the capacity to transport sediment. And hence, if we look at the Corps' bed elevation maps of the Mississippi Channel through this reach, you'll see that there's very rapid accretion on the bed of the Mississippi River, and they've actually had to start dredging in this reach to maintain the 50-foot channel in an area that they've never had to dredge before. And so there's a tie between these loss of containment failures and mostly in large floods, and then they're not sealed up. A reduction in stream power, an elevation change or an accretion in the riverbed, and hence an increased dredging need, which of course raises the cost of what's already an extremely expensive operation in order to keep the deep draft navigation channel going, with implications for import export that have national ramifications. Another ramification of this or implication of this is salt wedge intrusion. In low discharge, we have a salt wedge because the bottom of the river is below sea level, moving up the river and the only thing that keeps it back is the volume of freshwater flow. So when you turn that freshwater flow down in a drought event, you will see the salt wedge begin to creep up the river. And a lot of these communities, including Greater New Orleans, rely on river water for drinking water. And so the salt wedges can, in a severe condition, cause drinking water emergencies that affect upwards of several million people living along the banks of the river. And this is another numerical model that my colleague Ehab Maselli's group produced recently that has just come out, that they tried to examine why we see the saltwater intrusion events getting worse. And the test was, are we seeing it's a rising sea level? Is it a response to the deepening of the river, or is it something else? And it turns out it's the something else. It is, if you take this model and you run it with Neptune Pass and Fort St. Philip, these large exits that are the majority of the flow being lost from the river, if you close those off artificially in the model, you see that it progrades up the river on the order of 15 to 30 miles less upriver in a given discharge. And so we're making the loss of water through these exits is making the salt wedge emergency worse. In other words, it no longer takes a really severe extended drought and very low, long lasting low period in the Mississippi River before we have salt wedges beginning to impinge far enough upstream that they're beginning to contaminate or potentially contaminate water supplies for all the folks that live along this section of the river. Okay, so my last slide is just a couple of highlights. Water loss from the Lowermost River has increased by approximately 25%. These are the failures that occur along this section that is not protected by an artificial levee. The decrease in stream power from the water loss, along with basin-wide changes in land use and river engineering, has resulted in a dramatic drop in sediment delivery to the birdsfoot region. That's something I haven't really talked about, but if you're moving sediment through exits or it's being deposited on the bed and has to be dredged, it's not making it down to the birdsfoot region, and so we're in a degradational state in the delta at the very mouth of the river. And together, these changes threaten river containment, sustainability of the navigation channel, and future acceleration in sea level rise rates will likely worsen this problem significantly. Okay, so that is what I have. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Mead. Really appreciate it. And first question, you had that first bullet on the last slide, 25% increase since a point in the 2000s. Did you backcast? Like how quickly is that accelerating? So it's increased a lot
Well,
recently.
it's a stepwise thing, right? It's every time we have a major flood and we have another one of these failures along the East Bank, we see a stepwise increase as this new cut begins to cause more water to escape. And so we don't have a consistent policy in place whereby if one of these things happens, the Corps doesn't have any mandate, in other words, to come in and say, okay, well, we have to close this if it opens. And so I think there's a policy change that's going to have to be made if we're not going to extend the levee system, which was built, after the 27 flood. So it hasn't been re-examined in a century nearly. If we're not going to extend that MR&T levee all the way down on the East Bank to prevent this in the future, then we're going to have to come up with a policy, I think, that answers what do we do every time we have a large flood and there's a new one of these failures, because we're sort of like the kid putting their finger in the dike, right? And you're trying to plug things in it. And if sea level rise continues to accelerate, this problem is going to keep getting worse. And most of the models show the future of the Mississippi River being wetter, so we're probably going to have more big floods as well, which seem to be the triggers of these things.
And well, one, I'm going to remind people that you can put your questions in the chat. I'm also curious of, um, have there been attempts to close these crevasses and what has been successful, if anything, or have they just been allowed to occur?
Well, I mean, there has been a recent effort last summer by the Corps to begin rocking the entrance to Neptune Pass because their biggest concern has always been river capture, right? You can completely lose potentially the navigation channel, and the river will start passing down this new pathway along this exit. So that sort of gets that's more within their mandate. And so last summer they did go out and rock the channel of Neptune Pass and reduce it to back to where it was in 2016, but they didn't close it. And so there was no ongoing discussion about should we close it or should we not. There certainly was some land building beginning to occur out in the receiving area from Neptune Pass, and there were a number of articles that came out with scientists suggesting, maybe we should leave these things open because they're building land down here in this otherwise degraded situation. But of course, the problem is if if you're dealing with keeping the nav channel open and keep figuring out how to dredge it, this is making this problem worse. And so, it's a balance between is it good for the ecosystem to be building new land out there, but bad for the navigation channel to allow this tremendous loss in stream power. So the Corps has made some efforts in some of these cases, but the 1973 flood exits caused by at Fort St. Philip are still there, right? 50 years later, they have rocked them to make sure they don't get any larger. But they just sort of maintained what was created after that 73 flood. And there are a lot of issues with all that fresh water moving laterally out into the basin. There are arguments that potentially the oyster industry down here is being negatively affected by too much fresh water, too much turbid fresh water, and whether that cause is responsible for a collapse in the East Bank oyster industry. So there's a complicated series of stakeholder efforts or issues out here anytime you release water anywhere but the deep water Gulf of Mexico, right?
Absolutely. So a couple more questions. What is the driving major flood dynamics of the lower Mississippi? Excuse me, I misread that. What is driving the major flood dynamics of the lower Mississippi?
Well, major floods, this is the basin, right? We have a wet year, we have a dry year. And so we down in South Louisiana are simply recipients, sorry, I can't talk today, recipients of the amount of water that's collected in the drainage basin. So large flood years, we get large floods. And so the MR&T system is designed with a series of safety valves, but the first being the Bonnie Carey spillway when flows reaching the reach in Louisiana get above 1.25 million CFS. You begin to move water into into Lake Pontchartrain, the Morganza spillway, the Atchafalaya floodway. There are ways to handle floods all the way up to the size of the 1927 flood. And so that's one of the things that's not really well understood today is that the lowermost river below New Orleans never sees more than 1.25 million cubic feet per second simply because flood control means that anything larger than that is shunted off before it reaches this reach that we're talking about.
Thank you. The next person asks, they were questioning, is Bohemia Spillway mandated for receiving floodwaters? And how would more levees or controls on the left side of the river impact that function?
Bohemia, which we haven't talked about, is immediately below that Mardi Gras Pass area that began forming after around the 2011 flood. And that's sort of because again, we're in this reach of the river that's below the artificial levee part of the system. This is where there's a relatively low natural levee, and during floods, it naturally spills out over a broad region. As opposed to cutting a new exit, it flows out over several river miles along the left descending bank natural levee. And as far as I know, there is no mandate to limit that amount of flow. It's also very difficult to measure how much flow is going over the spillway, unlike an exit where you can get a boat in there and you can measure the flow of leaving a pass. You're really limited to trying to measure upstream of Bohemian, downstream of Bohemian, and subtracting that out and to try and figure out how much flow is going out of the spillway, and that can lead to some fairly large errors. So we don't know actually how much water is going over Bohemia right now, but it is uncontrolled.
Thank you. Do you have a feel for the sensitivity of wedge progression related to duration of low flow, i.e. the longevity of a low water event?
Right. I mean, certainly, if you hold discharge stable, discharge is the primary control, right? The more you turn down the water knob of fresh water coming down, the faster the wedge moves upstream because that's the sort of opposing force to it. But because the bottom of the river is below sea level until well north of Baton Rouge, basically conditions are always relevant that if you held discharge at a particular low point and you allowed it to happen for a longer period of time, it would continue to move northward, right? There's nothing to stop it until it gets so far north. The only thing, well, there are issues with loss of the saline water from the flow over top of it at the boundary of the salt wedge, and so the longer it gets, theoretically, it should slow down a little bit. But in reality, before we started to build artificial sills on the bottom, the Corps does during these salt wedge emergencies to try and halt the progression of the wedge, there are records showing that it could go well north of New Orleans all the way to Baton Rouge in extended periods of time. I think that the only point I was trying to make in today's presentation was we've made the problem worse. We're taking more water out of the river, and so it can come up past the Neptune Pass and Fort St. Philip area much faster, which means that a given number of days, it's going to end up further upstream.
Super, thank you. Next question. I think you've mentioned the fact that we've had back-to-back flood years, 2018 to 2020, and then back-to-back drought years, 23 to 25. And the questioner references two reports, Fredericks and Wolverton's, and they contributed the rapid inverse to evapotranspirations. Do you agree that it's an evapotranspiration trend?
That's way out of my expertise. I wouldn't want to comment on that degree. Certainly the long-term trends, the papers that have been written trying to look at the historical record from the stations that are longest lasting, more than a century of data, seem to suggest that the overall trend is for the river to get wetter. But of course, global weirding is all about the extremes become more extreme. So one could anticipate increasingly bad droughts and increasingly bad floods, even overprinted by an overall trend of rising discharge. That seems to be where the science is right now, with a lot of work still to be done, because as a lot of people online know, downscaling global climate models down to something like the scale of the Mississippi Basin to trying to predict what the future looks like in terms of water collected in the Mississippi Basin and discharged to this reach is a little bit a state of the art right now.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm just going to close. We got a comment about a thank you, hoping your science will continue to educate people in the basin about all the myriad of factors at play, and that the navigation community is very concerned about the lack of levees and would recommend extending levees. Look forward to hearing more about this. The saltwater sill is mitigation for the impacts of a deepened channel. And there are further actions at Neptune Pass coming on top of the 428 tons of rock already uh, placed there. So again, thank you for this really, really interesting talk. I would encourage you all, if you want to learn more, to read the paper. It's a good read. I've read it myself, and really thank you all for your participation. If you all want to share this, we'll have it up online within a couple days with the recording. And again, thank you so much, Mead. Really appreciate your time and all your work on this important issue.
Thanks everyone for listening.
All right. Take care, everyone.